Well, I think that's a really good sort of segue to the idea of post-black, which I think that show was in early 2002. We're talking about the exhibition Freestyle, which was curated by Thelma Golden at the Studio Museum, and you and probably, I don't know, 20 others were part of this exhibition, and the essay was pretty seminal, even though for people like us it was pretty obvious, but it was seminal in terms of a contribution to the field of art history and also identity, in that there is this idea of artists who did not want to be called black artists, although their work was steeped in a black experience and sort of complicating the notion of what being black was or is. And I still think that's pretty relevant, because although it makes sense to those of us, myself as a Latina curator and one who has studied that field, it makes sense to me, those complications. That's how I know the world and how I navigate the world. But it doesn't, it's still something that I think is maybe not completely accepted 100% by the establishment or by the canon. So when you're talking about you being the sum of your parts, I think that's the same thing for any artist, and we don't call a white artist a white artist. And yet we still, and sometimes even I as the director, feel compelled to call you an African American artist. And so that is, will you talk a little bit about your feelings about being included in that exhibition, and you know how, and maybe some other artists that we can talk about, like Glenn, Hahn, and other people who also were part of that discussion?
Sure. I personally don't really use the phrase post-black, because I find it, I don't even want to say problematic, because I don't even.
Because then there's like a pre and a post, and there's like a
post, and it's still predicated on being other,
right,
regardless. The fact that it's in the name predicates it on being other. So I try to avoid that altogether. I'm more interested in non-categorization at all. I mean, even in my process of working, I work in several different media. The point is, I'm not interested in being considered a sculptor, an installation artist, a performance artist, a painter. I just make things, you know. And I spend my time, I mean, I'm not a dilettante in that. But to label it is to limit it. And it makes things a little too palatable for people who look for those labels. Whereas I want to be something that's a little bit more evasive than that. So post-black for me is, we're post-black. I'm interested in the yester-next.
What was your title we were going to call it? Oh, it's your title for the Brooklyn Museum.
What?
Your, it's not your...
Oh, the introspective?
It's not a retrospective, it's an introspective. Right.
Yeah, I try to avoid all the, the labels, they always get so problematic. But as far as the contribution to the field, yes, it was important. And it was a great soundbite, it got a lot of attention. But, I think there's, I mean, I don't know, they're using the same phrase now for politics. What is this, post-racial politics, and that what we're supposed to be going through right now?
Right.
Whatever. The minute you name it, you're still stuck in it. So.
Well, I think it's really true that you're, and I write about in the catalog, and we've talked about this at length, is that your work really does shrug off any kind of attempt to try to describe it or contain it. And it is incredibly sort of slippery and elliptical, and once you think you've gotten a hold of the meaning, there's other meanings, and we can talk about maybe smirk, which is now called smirk, which is the smiling face, which looks like maybe a Cheshire cat, and it's a sculpture, and it appears in photography, and it appears in your so it's like this recurring motif. But then there's also, you can sort of do a 360 or 180.
180. 90. 45.
You can do like a 36.5-ish. And then there's, blackface and the minstrelsy and the big red lips and the kind of sting that comes along with that. And so there's always this kind of slipperiness, and I think that's what makes it really powerful. And also, I kind of also, in studying about your work and learning about Buddhism vis-a-vis our conversations, I think that there is this idea of non-attachment that is really central to Buddhist philosophy. And it is in the non-attachment that you can really sort of let go of things that might weigh you down.
Exactly. And that's what I'm attempting to do. It's difficult. It's an experiment. I'm still going through the process myself of using these very heavy signifiers and symbols and icons that we do associate with one particular experience.
Like lynching. Tying,
lynching, but read through another or seen through another lens could also be bondage, which on some level can be a violent act, but is also an act of intimacy. And it's somewhere in between these opposites that I'm looking to navigate. Once again, to elude being easily categorized. And the work itself, I think, is starting to do that. The more confused I am while making a piece now, the more successful it is to me, regardless of what it ends up looking like.
I think that, ultimately, Sanford, I think this exhibition is such a success because I remember us having a conversation, maybe about 2.5 years ago, in one of the early studio visits when we were starting to think about this show, and you talked about maybe some of your work it was so seductive. I mean, the craftsmanship with your work is incredibly skilled and high, and so it's very seductive, and also these sort of sand drawings that you've done, or these really luscious pieces, really kind of compel the viewer, and then sometimes maybe stop the viewer because you're dealing with issues that are like either these like very romantic sort of Buddhist ideas, or like very, very powerful slave, African American history, and so it sort of tends to stop. And one of our discussions in a studio visit was like, I really want to get beyond. I want to have a little bit more of a open-ended narrative and open-ended reading. And I think that you've really, from some of your works maybe 5 years ago to now, you've really accomplished that. And I think in an as of yet to be seen sculpture that is in the making as we speak, that really kind of, if you think about that as a post, versus maybe the, maybe the big ass band piece where you've got this disco ball that's sort of exploded on the floor, that kind of looks like a constellation. Going from one to the other, you really, I think, have sort of moved into this like much more sort of open-ended terrain.
Yeah, I'm still working through it. It's like therapy, it's day by day. But
can you talk to us about that sculpture?
The new one?
Codex.
The Codex, whatever it may be called. I'll try to describe it. It is sort of a sculptural collage that has the back of a clear acrylic chair with chrome legs that's been dismantled, so that it's just a formal element of 2 chrome legs and 1 curved acrylic back. And it's slanted. And resting upon that is a steel frame that I welded together. It looks a bit figurative, but not quite abstracted for sure. Definitely geometric. And those are connected, so they form basically a tripod. So the figurative part actually goes down to a point, not 2 legs, but 1 point. And then the 2 legs from the chair create a tripod. And they're held together by very beautiful gold metallic trimming. That was, it's like a 1/4-inch rope type of trim.
Is it like a dookie chain? This is one of the words that I learned from
No, less of a dookie chain, but more like blinged out bondage rope.
Okay, all right, sweet.
And I've tied this frame, this figurative armature to the back of the chair and in an embrace, so that they're solid together.
Okay.
But aesthetically, it's very clear and actually very sparse. But as I've tied it together, I've crisscrossed the trimming in such a way that it creates a very intricate pattern along the back of this figure, which looks on some levels like a sacred geometric diagram. Right. On some levels, it looks like a constellation connecting the dots, and on a very big level, it refers to this image that I've shown you of a slave. It's a very famous image, actually. It's the back of a slave that is completely riddled with lashings, and the scar and keloid has grown so large that it creates a huge pattern of X's and crosses on his back. So that's really what